I still have a habit of being an academic, so some of this will be teaching to get some ideas across to you and convince you that some ideas that aren't current practice are worth pursuing. But I also want to describe a very exciting solution that our startup has for fixing up businesses that have got some kinds of problems. This talk's a bit related to the previous talk, which was a medical system about diagnosing patients and following through with prescriptions and what's going on. In our case, we're not interested in humans, we're interested in businesses and diagnosing them. Well, we might be interested in patients too. Okay, this is just an overview of where we're coming from. Machine learning, we all know quite a bit about machine learning. It's got several variants. Supervised learning is what everybody does to build predictive models, classification, propensity prediction, and generally supervised learning is in a problem domain where there's a lot of data, and there's lots and lots of methods that you will use to use those kinds of methods to solve business and social problems. Second kind of learning is unsupervised learning. That's where you've got a lot of data, but it's never been labelled. We don't know if it's about good things or bad things, or high scores or low scores, or lots of money or not much. But unsupervised learning lets you organise that data to find general patterns and structure within it. There's many examples of that. Clustering is a version of that. Hebbian learning deep down is related to it. And there's plenty of structural methods, that most of which have three-letter acronyms. So PCA, SOM, SVD, LDA, and the list goes on for a really long time. A third kind of learning that's in between those two is reinforcement learning. And this is where your data has been described as good or bad, but you don't know, once you're doing something with it, in which way it's good or bad. It's like you go to school, you write an essay, the teacher gives you a 9 and you think that's good, or they give you a 6 and you think that's bad, but they don't give you any notes on what you could do to make it better. That's the reinforcement approach. It's punishment and reward. The supervised approach will tell you what you could do to write a better essay as well. But providing that kind of feedback is more expensive, and lazy teachers don't often do that. Sorry, that's a bias. Way down in the bottom corner, within semi-supervised learning, which is similar to reinforcement learning, there's this thing called active learning. And that, I think in the room we'd have less people familiar with it. So can I have a show of hands if you've used active learning? Thank you. One. You've heard of active learning? Cool. You've heard of control theory? Yeah, we're getting closer now. Okay, active learning is a part of semi-supervised learning, and we don't confuse that with active learning that's involved in education systems where you stop students being bored and get them engaged in what's going on. So the basic approach is central to that. You have a lot of potential data, but most of it hasn't been labelled with the kind of field value that you're trying to predict. Like if you're trying to classify something as having a disease or not having a disease, you've got lots of patients and you don't know their health status, and a smaller number of patients where you do know their health status. So that's the known data set, which have some attributes, and those patients or those case records are labelled. Then you have another data set, the unknowns. They've got properties or attributes, x1 to xn, but what you know about them is dot. They haven't been labelled yet. And typically, the unknown set is much larger than the known set. And there's a special case later about the unknown unknowns that we'll get to. Typically, this comes along when labelling data is expensive or time-consuming, or it may be that you simply don't know because nobody's bothered to go off and measure something that would be the equivalent of labelling some data. In addition to that, there's the concept of having a working model. So with what data you have available from the known labelled data, you can build a model. It's pretty crap, because you didn't have much data to build it from, but it's something. So there's now a trade-off between trying to get more data labelled and just using the working model. And in active learning terminology, that's often referred to as an exploration versus an exploitation trade-off. If you keep trying to label more data, it costs you more money, which will ultimately give you a new model, but it costs. If you need to do some predictions now, you can use the working model, and that's the exploitation of what you currently know. So exploitation finds new information so the working model gets better until it becomes adequate or better than adequate. The technical question is, how do you explore this well? And that really is an optimization exercise to maximise the information gain by not just labelling data, but knowing what data you want to label next. Active learning's got very many applications. Going back to the early days, there were things like robotics. Nowadays, there's things like your robot vacuum cleaner that's trying to learn the floor plan. There's that sad story about the robotic vacuum cleaner that didn't know about what the cat left on the carpet. So it covered the whole floor. Another version that goes back a long way is the exploration of a student's mind in computer-aided instruction and intelligent tutoring. That's a labour-intensive form of active learning where you're diagnosing ignorance and then providing a program of education to fill in the gaps. Yeah, and that's been promised to be really good for the last 40 years. There's systems that do it well, but only within narrow domains of knowledge, because knowledge is big. Drug design, if you want to make some new drugs, well, anyone might want to make new drugs. If you want to make some new drugs, you need to observe the effects, but making a new chemical and testing it on people and paying them to be subjects and seeing if they die or whatever, that's expensive. So the active learning in that explores explores the space of what you could do to change the chemicals to be medically effective. Intervention strategies in general can use active learning. So you treat patients in a particular, you treat customers in a particular way so you don't lose them. What particular way would be the best way to treat customers so you don't lose them? That's the interventions can be optimised to solve those problems. Dynamic spam filters, you have a small number of spams, a whole lot of labelled non-spams, and a huge universe of nobody knows emails. So you can top them up with labelling more spams on the way through. But people have to be paid to label spam. Or maybe not, maybe they volunteer them. Document and topic classification, which is Stephen's interest. Coping in hazardous environments, where going into a hazard environment to find out what's going on is expensive in terms of you mightn't come back. And online ad auctions, where I used to work in brand screen, where you want to know how much you should bid to place a particular ad on one of the 200,000 ad placements per second throughout Asia Pacific. How much should you bid in an auction? And not burn up all your budget straight away. They're all examples. Yeah, is it still exciting? How are we going to tie this to anything next? So we can park that for a moment, because we'll be back. The next thing is something that, who's experienced business coaching in their life? I have. Was it pleasant? No. Okay. What is it? It's something that business coaches do. That doesn't tell us very much. It's focused on senior staff, the CEO, the MD, the senior management team, senior leadership team and so on. It's strategic. It's about looking at what the business needs to do in general over time in a sensible way, not to lose it. It's focused on the concept of business acumen, which is, I guess, a synonym for wise day-to-day activities. It's generally very expensive if you use one of the consultant firms. No, I won't name them, but there's half a dozen that I could name, you could be looking at $500,000 to $5 million to fix your business. The general approach is you work out what to fix, you do a diagnostic and research phase to find out what's going on in this business that is okay, what's not okay, what's terrible, identify the gaps, the strengths and the weaknesses, and then pragmatically attack those to find out what is worthwhile to try and fix. The last bit is you produce a really, really, really thick report, making sure that you haven't got the wrong company name in the report. And then you hand it to someone who's probably going to need glasses. After you know what to fix, you then have to work out how to fix, and that's a prescription phase, which is about required adjustments and advice to a company and the kind of support you need to give to the company to stop being a basket case if they are. Coaches normally specialise. So one of the big three-letter consultancies around town will generally tell you you've got a project management problem, and they have a solution for it. And they have a solution for the second phase as well. So sometimes it's not that problem. There's thousands of books written on this all the time. You can read them, but it's the same as reading the reports. There's hundreds of approaches and frameworks. And there's common sense in all of them, but they don't always, it doesn't always fit to a given business. The broad approach is to analyse a business strategically. That's what our system's also designed to do. To build a model of the business from these observations. That's what our system's designed to do. To compare the model to an ideal model. That's what our system's designed to do. To identify strengths, weaknesses, gaps and opportunities, and you know what I'm going to say. To write a big fat report. Well, it's not that fat. Making recommendations for change. And then send in a coaching team. And we don't really send in a coaching team. We have some coaches as part of Longitude, but we can recommend coaches who most align to the business's needs for recovery. So you don't see the heart surgeon to solve your eye problems. Okay, I've lost someone. I didn't think it was that bad. One problem, I can't say all of this because it's going to go on YouTube. So the horror stories, I'll tell you after. Consultants may have a vested interest in selling you a given solution when it isn't really the right one. Does anyone believe that? One person believes it. Oh, good. So you guess what the recommendations would be. The framework and report templates may not actually align with the business. It's common both in IT and management consulting to have a solution ready to try to squeeze your problem into. It doesn't always work. The language of the framework may not make sense to the business that's being consulted to keep healthy. Invoices are normally a lot of money. Recommendations may be somewhat less than actionable. They say, look what we found, rather than this is what you should do. And it takes a lot of time from the senior leadership team to be analysed to find out what the truth is about the business's problems. Now, this is part 3, Longitude Systems. I know 2 business coaches. Anthony Aarons is over there, or it may be Bob Singh, I'm not sure. They've been how can I put it? They have experienced business coaching from both sides of the fence, both doing it and receiving it. I'm an old data scientist with experience in both business solutions and startups and doing modelling and predictive AI and all those things that Fabian mentioned. I also had coaching experience in some sports and team building in academia. So most of the people who work with me managed to complete the week without having a nervous breakdown. We were introduced by the lovely Anthony Wolstenholme, and we met often at the Castlereagh Boutique Hotel for discussions and planning. Has anyone been to that hotel? You don't know what you've missed. It's in Castlereagh Street. I suggest you go and have a look, especially if you like masons. Art Deco architecture, and being the youngest person in the room by several generations. Is that true, Anthony?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the longitude system starts. Our first meeting, we decided to democratize business coaching with an app. How to start. We had to work out what business coaches did. I had two in the room, so that was easy. We just interrogate them for a long while. The process of diagnosis is that the business coaches first start asking lots of questions and may review some documents, but mainly they'll ask questions about what's going on, what's going to hell, what's missing, all the kinds of disasters, and well, the answers will reveal disasters or normal status or excellent status. I asked Anthony and Bob to provide all possible questions they might ask of any business. And that gave us a universe of questions to work from. The only problem with that is we couldn't ask all those questions to a given business because they'd go, well, they wouldn't like it. It would take them probably 4 weeks to answer all those possible questions. So questionnaire design is something that I didn't do in this. Questionnaire design is an art and a science. It uses experimental design to gain information from the subjects, the respondents. It exploits the semantics and knowledge inside people's heads and does all other sorts of stuff that I'll ignore. We collated a huge number of questions, and I've already mentioned that, I think. So, and it was about anything, asking about anything that may be relevant to diagnosing any business. The problem is, when we're diagnosing a business, it's not any business, it's that business. So challenges were what questions to actually ask, how to select those questions from our universe, how to interpret the answers to the questions, how to model the business, how to interpret the model, and how to avoid boring and fatiguing the question respondents. And I think we succeeded in all of those. So, but let's continue the story. Active learning comes back to the rescue, so I said we'd come back to this. There are 3 criteria for deciding what next question to ask and pull out of the universe and put in front of the person. One aspect is novelty. We don't want to ask questions that have already been asked or are similar to questions that have already been asked. Second is information gain, which basically means we want the working model to improve as a result of the questions being asked. And the third, criticality, means that we want to ask questions that explore the bits of the business that are going to hell in a handbasket. If they're doing really well at culture, we don't want to ask them a lot of culture questions. We might want to ask them leadership questions where the issues happen to lie, or process management. So the information gain part is a bit like decision trees that everyone in this room knows something about, but it's working in reverse. We're discovering the data on the way through so we can build a model rather than having the data to construct an explanatory tree. It's like, what should we put into the tree to make it a better tree? Novelty is more about exploring more broadly, so you don't tie yourself into a corner when you're interrogating someone. And criticality is about exploring problem areas rather than normals. So, putting this more simply, answered questions correspond to labelled data, the set of known records. Unanswered questions are unlabelled, the unknowns. There's a third kind of question, which is the Rumfield ones, the unknown unknowns, and they're questions we don't even know the questions yet. So, but they're important too, because we need to keep looking. So essentially what we've got is an active questionnaire. If you've ever worked in market research, you saw boring questionnaires that are 68 pages long, and what we've got is something that shortcuts that. Efficiency comes from active learning steering you to the next best question to ask to get the understanding you need. The semantics of the questions and answers play a major role, and it's basically an interrogation process. Does anyone recognise the photo from Breaking Bad? Interrogation? All right, next one. The business model, this is described very simply. It took about 6 months, but it's very simple. It's hierarchical. There's an overall score for the business, which is out of 100. There's a systemic score and a human score for how that business is going. So whether their practices are good, whether their ways they deal with humans are good. Then the systemic factors are built of 3 elements, which are the core parts of the model. That's execution, growth and process. So we measure each of those. The questions populate those with scores. And human factors compose 3 factors or 3 elements about culture, leadership and people. Yeah, so if we know that much about a business, we've covered all the bases. At least that's what Anthony and Bob have convinced me is more than perfect in diagnosing a business. So, stating again, execution, effectiveness, growth and process, or what happens because of the way the business is structured, and humanistic are culture, leadership and people development, about how the human side of business activities run. Each question maps to one of the main elements. Each question maps partly to some other of those 6 elements. Sometimes it maps partially to all 6 of them. And an example of that is, there's a question, there's how many people are on the leadership team? Right? And if it's too big, that's bad. If it's too small, that might be bad too. But this mapped 100% to leadership effectiveness, but it also mapped to execution effectiveness. If the leadership team was too big, it's not only going to have leadership issues, it's going to have, to a lesser extent, execution problems, because the team's too big. Most questions map to 2 or more elements, and the weighting process involved, again, many meetings at the Castlereagh Boutique Hotel before we reached a resolution. 4 types of questions, just to fill in the details: yes, no's, choose one of, choose all applicable, and a rating scale kinds of question. The standard kinds of questions you deal with in real life. We have methods for scoring the answers to convert them to numeric scores, which had parameters that were tuned, until we agreed that the numbers that we got for answers, everything's converted to numbers. The numbers we got for answers to each question were good. They reflected how good or bad an answer was. And it turned out we only had a small number of methods needed to be used, and the parameters to drive them were quite, a committee could agree on them. Another thing we did was mapped each question, or tagged each question, with semantic tags. So we had 36 semantic meaningful things that the questions could be about. A given question might be about 4 or 5 attributes. That same, how many people are on the leadership team? The semantic attributes were, for that one, information flow, executive teamwork, functional leadership and accessibility. And 32 other flags were not set for that question. And the tags let us give an abstract but more clear-cut understanding of those questions. Questions that had a lot of attribute flags turned on were too general. They were covering too many bases of information. So what do we do for them? We chop them into smaller questions that are more narrowly focused. During a client diagnostic session, we use the Hamming distance. Will I ask? No. Which measures a difference between vectors of 32 fields of zeros and ones to tell how questions are different from each other. We transformed the similarities into differences, and that allowed us to tell how questions were different from the ones that had already been asked. And that then fed into find the question that was next most novel. The other 2 criteria, you remember, were about information gain and criticality. They came from an element's sample standard deviation to give its level of precision, so we want to squeeze that down. And the second one was to look at the mean of an element. If it was low, then that moved it into more critical. If it was high, if you've got 95, that's a good score. That's not critical at all. And all those 3 criteria were combined in a way to ultimately come up with selection of a question. The selection process was optimised in simulation to know that little parameters were tweaked in them to know how we were going to transform standard deviation and the mean into something that forced us to move in the right direction. How do we know when to stop? The simple answer to that is the sum of this 6 elements sample standard deviations. Once that came down to a small enough number, it was the time to stop. How do we know what that small enough number was? Well, we had runs of questionnaires that went way past a normal stopping point, and we just had to look for when the system became stable. Then we can say, all right, that's a reasonable stopping point. So evaluation by simulation. Then there comes a report. I'm almost at the end now. My time's probably almost at the end as well. So the diagnostic scores got spat out into spider charts or diagnostic diagrams. The human factors and the overall score and the systemic factors were all reported as raw numbers, but say, oh look, you're doing better at the human side than you are at system side. Not very actionable. Then the elements, they came out into radar plots. I'm going to show you some actual ones of those on the next couple of slides. And they were also mapped into heat maps from good, fair, needs some attention, needs urgent attention, and the one below that we haven't decided to name yet because it's kind of sell your shares now. Under those numbers for the element scores, there is a canned text engine that would generate text depending on what levels those element scores were in. So the report was populated by text that had already been written, but it was customised to the levels that you saw. However, those 6 elements, they sounded pretty interesting at the beginning, but they're pretty abstract as well. So they were decomposed into 24 business factors that were very much more concrete. And that was used then for more prescriptive analysis of a business to say, not only do we know what your problems is, but these are specific things that need fixing. Is it still making sense? There's a few other bells and whistles. We had different lenses on the question sets and the way answers were scored for enterprises and SMEs and departments and not-for-profits, because they all have different kind of standards of whatever they do, and some questions aren't relevant to a department, for example. We also had some profile and starter questions that asked things like industry type, size, how long have you been in business, and they were preloaded. Some of the broad challenges of the business, what are your major operational challenges, and you can choose up to 8. If you choose all 8, then you get a score of about 0 for that question. And there's some notion of benchmarking to understand, say, accommodation and engineering have different benchmarks for different kinds of activities, so different elements. So, and there's other bells and whistles, but you won't let me say them because we'll run out of time. So the user experience, session duration depended on who was being talked to and how bad the company was. If it was a good and consistent company, we were all done in 45 minutes or less and 80 questions. If it was a dodgy company, then it could take 120 or so questions, all different questions for different business, and more than an hour. And a company that had inconsistencies in some of its elements, answering goods and bads, that could take much longer and get to well over 2 hours. And we have experienced that a couple of times. Anthony remembers as well. Yeah, nearly there. So the user experience, it's quite intense. The CEOs get nervous when they're experiencing these questions because it's an active interrogator. It's not saying, I will just ask you a lot of friendly questions. It goes for the jugular aggressively. It's like swimming with piranha. We've run our system with individual owners or CEOs. We've run it with small senior leadership teams. We've run it with individuals from leadership teams, and they don't always work the same way. And in most cases, will we say all, Anthony? All. In all cases, the report, the diagnosis and the recommendations have been taken on board as being, yes, you got it, and thanks for telling us what to do next. But there'd be further recommendations on maybe you need to talk to specialists in repairing those issues. So there's no demo because we haven't got time. If you want a demo, my email address is on the slide, which will be on the website pretty soon. I want to thank Dave Chong and Paul Rule from Mobiusly, who turned my scrappy prototype into an excellent and compelling user experience and web app. With everything was good. So here's a business. And what you can see is that the PM axis is the weakest one. They're doing very well in culture, people development and growth strategies, but they're a bit stuffed in execution effectiveness as well. Yeah?
Project management, right?
Process management. I sometimes confuse the two. They are different. The deep down, I'm not going to reveal the deep down conclusions of this because it's an actual company. There were some aspects of process management that were complete gaps, or we know what our processes are, they're in our heads, but there were other processes in the same business that were done properly. And the system went through and exhausted the process management questions because it was really trying to get to the bottom of what was going on. Here's three more. Tara, Todd and Terry, they're all T's. They're from the development system rather than live customers. Todd is unfinished as yet. The confidence intervals here show that it hasn't squeezed down to a certain certainty response yet, but the spider charts give you an intuitive feel for what's going on before you look at deeper diagnostics. That's another company well known to one of us. I set the bottom score in the spider chart to 40, but they got way below that. I think at this point it was at 9, and it's a real company that still exists. Well, does it still exist? Yeah. All of the scores on that spider chart were bad, but the culture score was absolutely the worst. So true story, bro. 85% churn of staff. There you go. Okay, and so if you know any business coaching questions that you think I might need to know, just tell me. We'll put them in the universe. Maybe a finder's fee. And any other questions I'll try to answer. Fabian, have I gone over time yet?
All good, wonderful.
Okay, thanks.
So let's start with questions. Thank you very much, Tom. And please join me in thank you. Anyone?
I'm not a business coach. You can.
Would you like to go into a little bit more about the 2-hour type situations? What sort of led you down that rabbit hole?
The usual thing is that the exploration had to keep continuing because they would be answering, say, for example, some process management questions with answers that were really bad and others that were really good answers. So the sample standard deviation for that element never squeezed down to the tolerance bands we wanted to see to know it would stop. And in fact, when we ran it a bit longer, it still drifted by about 2 or 3 points in an upward direction. So it's that, the 2 or 2.5 hours was actually what was needed to get to a diagnosis. If we stopped early, it would have actually looked worse than that. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. How do you assess the performance of the system? So you have diagnosed a business and you give them advice. Do you follow on and able to determine if this advice was the right one or not?
Yes, but we've only been doing this for, when was our first? June last year was the first paid alpha test. The general approach is to get them to then implement some changes and then re-diagnose after a settling in period. A second version, which we have to get to, is to benchmark industry sectors but we haven't got enough businesses in our system to do that yet.
Can I just have a follow-on question? Like, do you assess their financial performance, for example, and be able
Okay,
to use that as a
the feedback when we've run a few more businesses is to see if they're still in growth. If they're in growth, they're doing well. If they're static, there should have been some unresolved issues. If they've gone out of business, chances are that something broke. And we think we've found what that something is. This is still a strategic tool, so it's saying if you want to do better, these are some critical issues you need to fix. And the factor analysis at the bottom makes it quite clear. Deep down in the engine, there's the questions that were actually answered, so it's possible for us to even understand a further level down what atomic issues there are. So it's how do we verify it? Well, that's the business aspect of verification. In the modelling process, the verification is done by running simulations across long completed surveys, so we can see what would we need to do to get enough good answers to reach the right spider chart, the right 6 element scores, without taking 3 months or 4 weeks to get an answer.
One more question over here.
Hi, yeah. You might have slightly answered the question already, but I'm curious whether you would have considered the possibility of producing, sort of interrogating the businesses that do particularly well in particular areas to try and produce a sort of list of good practices, so sort of take it from the other angle rather than going into businesses that are struggling and saying, what's going wrong here, looking at businesses in general and saying, what are the things you could, I work for a small business, for example, there's only a few of us for a start, looking at a sort of general list of good practices, like looking at a good culture and saying, what do they do?
I'm going to interrupt, but I haven't answered that question yet. The kind of question you're asking is about daily practice more than about strategic aspects of a business. Coaching's about focusing the business on its strategic direction and making sure there's no holes. Analysing a business for its day-to-day operations, does it have the right structure? Is it complying with all the regulatory requirements? Are you day-to-day managing things properly? We could build a version of this that was focused on that, but it wouldn't be a coaching app. It would be a kind of a secondary kind of management consultant that comes in and reorganises the structure. So thanks for the suggestion. We do have plans to apply this method to other domains apart from coaching as well. Because obviously, if data is expensive and you can reach a conclusion in an efficient way, this can do it. Yeah, is Fabian going to kick me off now?
One more concluding question here.
Sorry to keep you from the drinks. It seems to me like there's a ground truth here. Right? So, there must be a correct answer to the question. Would that be correct?
No. They're allowed to skip questions, but there are some questions that have penalties if they skip them. In other cases, a skip is because a question isn't applicable to that business. But we put parameters into the scoring method, so that is based on, yes, the value judgments of Anthony and Bob as experienced business coaches.
So what about questions which might change in the context of questions that have been answered previously in the methodology?
Oh, yeah. There's other details I didn't include, like there are linked questions that disqualify some questions from being asked or that are preconditions for the scoring methods. And there's not many of those, but there are a lot of linked questions. So it goes question, it hooks onto then a sequence of questions unless the answer is no for something. So yeah.
Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Please join me again. And